Racial unity. One thing I want to say about this, and I said this every time, it's not a disclaimer, it's just I really want to acknowledge the fact that this is an emotional topic. And I don't want to come across as being uncompassionate about people's experiences, because some people have had, this is a serious topic because there have been serious offenses in the past, there's serious wounds in people. It arouses serious emotions in people that don't have serious wounds. The problem with our emotions is not that we have that reaction. Those can be very good reactions. The problem comes when we let our emotions determine our view of what is true. The problem with that is that when you do that, the other person also has emotions, and if that determines their view of truth, you have an unsolvable problem. Think about Arabs, Jews in the Middle East. That's a very emotional situation. On the one hand, they say, we feel you've done us wrong, we hate you, and we're going to obliterate you. On the other side, they say, we feel you have done us wrong, and we will combat with you. The problem with feelings is there's no basis for communication. And so I'm not discounting it, I'm simply saying that in this series, we want to get past how we feel and look to what we believe is true. That's difficult with some of the ideologies we're looking at that don't actually believe in truth. So here's our purpose. We have a very specific and narrow purpose in this series because we have 3 lessons. The first is to understand the prevalent viewpoint that is driving race discussion in America. We're not going to understand every viewpoint that's out there, but we have talked about critical race theory. That was our first lesson. Please, I'm going to do a quick recap, but it is not going to talk about everything we did in our first lesson. Critical race theory is the dominant cultural ideology on this issue. It is not the only one, but it is far and away driving events. Second, understand the radical nature of the biblical view of racial unity. In our last lesson, we looked at the biblical template, the biblical model for how God sees the human race. And I think you saw that in almost every key respect. I think this is a fair assessment of the two. If you just listen to the two, write down the issues. In almost every key respect, the Bible differs from critical race theory. They simply don't have the same fundamental core values or commitments. They're at fundamental odds. And then third, let's chart a practical way forward, which is the point of this lesson. So I'm going to do a summary, but before I do, questions going in.
Well, just a question about critical race theory before we get too far down the road. Is critical race theory specific to the United States, or is it a worldwide idea?
That's a good question. Critical race theory is not just specific to the United States, but critical race theory is a big issue in the United States. If you think about the foundations of critical race theory in Marx's idea of the class understanding of history, and then critical race theory applying that to remember, critical theory in general, because there are a lot of critical theories, and that doesn't mean they're scientific, it's an ideology, it's a faith system, it's a belief system, literally, is critical race theory's distinctive is that problems in race have to do with the systems in your culture, not so much the individuals. In other words, it's not about, well, why don't we just tell everybody not to act racist? No, not good enough. Your justice system is inherently racist. Your financial system is inherently racist. Your education system is inherently racist. So this is far more prevalent in the United States. Critical race theory is not let me put it this way. It is not the predominant cultural mover of race relations, for example, in Europe. It doesn't even exist in the socialist countries. So you can think about it as predominantly United States. That's a good question. Well, let's talk about it a little bit. The modern secular story, the modern secular idea has certain key ideas. And I want to put them up because you're going to see as you think about it, well, I've read the New Testament and boy, it's very, very different than this. But if you want to understand why things are happening, Here are the basic tenets. Conflict and tension between groups, in this case races, are inevitable, and in fact, they're necessary. All of life is a struggle between different groups of people. Truth is simply a viewpoint. Don't bother me with facts. Those are your facts to support your narrative, and I don't want to hear your oppressive facts. I have my own facts. Justice is not objective. It's measured by how it serves to address the imbalance of power. So for example, what is just when you're treating groups of one identity group is not the same as what is just treating people in a different identity group. These are the basis of the secular story. Moral actions are judged by how they serve oppressed people. You can do something if you're in an oppressed group that is morally good, and that same action would not be morally good if you were in an oppressor group. That's our modern secular story of pitting groups against each other. Critical race theory applies that in this way. Your identity is derived from your racial or cultural group. Your identity is not primarily individual. It is as a part of a group. Okay, so you will see different groups, like I might be a black man and consequently I'm part of an historically oppressed group. I might be a black woman, in which case I'm part of a historically two oppressed groups. I might be part of another group. And in other words, your identity, it doesn't matter whether you have been oppressed, your identity is part of that group. Racism is normal. It's the common experience daily of people of color. These are assumptions. There's not data to prove this. This is a what's called a self-certifying system, meaning this is what we assume to be true, and that is true. How do you know it's true? Because I believe it's true. In other words, it's self-certifying. It's not scientifically verifiable. It's not verifiable by any scientific means. It's self-certifying. If you believe it, you believe it. Truth is socially constructed, meaning this is why you get frustrated sometimes seeing double standards. If you understand this, there's no double standard. Anything the oppressor group says is just not true. It's just trying to keep power. And you go, wait a minute, that's not fair. Whoa, fairness is all in the eyes of the beholder. So you see what I'm trying to say? I'm just trying to point out to you, these things make sense if you have this belief system. Here is one of the key ideas of critical race theory is the institutions in America are inherently racist and those structures must be overturned. Let everybody out of jail. Prison system is flawed. Defund the police. Police are inherently, systemically racist. And you might say, well, wait a minute. Maybe that policeman is, maybe that policeman's not. That's not where you get your identity from. Policemen are policemen as a group. It's a racist institution. Identity is based on your group. And then white people are incapable of non-racism. For example, if you take a proponent of critical race theory and you say, well, I'm a white person and my goal is to be colorblind, to treat people as people and not by the color of their skin. Well, that's just proof that you're racist and you don't even realize you're racist. In other words, it's baked into the assumptions. Does that make sense? This should make sense when you watch the news and you go, that's what's happening here. That's what's behind it. So that is critical race theory. I quoted a few things for you because my sources are original sources. I'm not making up what I think critical race theory is. I'm telling you what the best sellers, if you will, Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, New York Times bestsellers, talking about what critical race theory is. One of the interesting things about critical race theory is the idea of equality and equity. And so the idea of equality is having roughly equal opportunities and rights. The idea of equity is having equal outcomes and proportional outcomes. And so Ibram Kendi's point is, if you really want to fix this system, you must what's called reverse discrimination. Critical race theorists don't believe in that term. They believe it's justifiable discrimination to set the balance right. Vodi Bakum, Christian, I would highly recommend his book, Fault Lines, to you. I think I put it on the handout. It's just well-reasoned tons of quotes from critical race theorists, so you know that you're engaging with the people that actually believe this and not some straw man. Points to the fact that equity has never and will never exist in human society. It is not a biblical idea. Equality is very much a biblical idea, and that is something we should be striving for. Equity is not a biblical idea, nor is it attainable. But while we're on this slide, I want to pick up two questions from our last lesson that fit here. So here's one of the questions. Assume that women and people of color are equal to white men in terms of ability, intelligence, etc. I definitely make that assumption. I love the first part of that question. Wouldn't true social equality lead to greater equity? Good question. What critical race theorists say, there's not equity. You don't have 50% women on this board of directors, ergo, you don't have equality. That's not a good argument. The fact that you don't have equity says nothing about equality. You might have inequality, and you might not. I think one of the examples I gave you is 88% of nurses in America are female. Well, that's not equitable. But I don't think anybody thinks that men are being discriminated against to become nurses. I don't think I think there's equality of opportunity there. So inequity doesn't by any, that's one example. You could think in the next 5 minutes of 50 examples like that. But in none of those cases would you say inequity means there must be discrimination. I don't think so. I don't think anybody thinks so. There might be, and there have been in certain cases, and those are the things that we should address. So if there's equality of opportunity, you would tend to expect more equity where people want there to be more equity. In other words, there's equality of opportunity in nursing in America. I'm just going to keep picking on nursing for a minute. In nursing in America, but I don't think you'll ever see a 50-50 split of men and women, but I don't think that's because it's unequal. In fact, there have been some really, I'll tell you the place to look for this, let's just talk about men and women for a minute, is Scandinavian countries. Scandinavian countries are far more egalitarian than America. I mean, they have a longer history of equal opportunity for men and women. And the interesting thing is they show, and they do have more equity in certain areas than America does. And I think that's a valid point. But there are whole industries that don't have equity. And so the point there is it's not discrimination, it's choice. So if there was truly equality, would there be more equity? Yes, to some extent, but you will not ever get to equity because people have choices. It may just be that not that many men choose to be nurses. Now, when you have a case where there are people that want to be, but they don't have equal opportunity to be, that's inequality. That is a big issue. So that's a fair question, and the answer is kind of yes and no, but I hope you see the nuance in that. Secondly, how does critical race theory deal with mixed race marriages? Not well. I mean, if you just think about it, there are a lot of things that burst that fundamental bubble of your identity is based on your group affiliation. We gave you some examples last time about that does not hold true throughout history. It doesn't hold true throughout the world. People's identity, for example, the Bosnian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, had nothing to do with the color of your skin, had nothing to do with the way you looked. These people were identical to each other. It had to do with completely different criteria. And so the idea of identity groups is a problem because you don't see that playing itself out uniformly. How do critical race theorists talk about this? They would say, for example, a black man like Vodi Bakum, who says critical race theory is not biblical at all. Critical race theory is dangerous. And by the way, it's not just Christians who are criticizing that. It's dangerous to criticize it, but there are a lot of intellectuals who say this is not a healthy worldview. So it's not just Christians, but let's say Vodi Bakum, what would you say about him? You would say, well, he's obviously here are the things that get said. You're a traitor to your race. You're not really black. You you're an Uncle Tom. You're not politically black. Yeah, your skin may be black, but you aren't in solidarity with. In other words, you've got to somehow explain away the examples of people that say, wait a minute, I'm black, I'm female, I'm whatever, and I don't actually agree with that. Mixed ethnic backgrounds of people are really difficult to deal with, because then who oppressed whom? Which group are you in? It doesn't work out very well. And as our culture becomes more integrated and more homogenous, you see more marriages and children from all kinds of different ethnic groups. This is going to break down even more and more, because that's kind of inexplicable. So, short version, CRT does not deal well with that. It's a very difficult issue. We then moved on to the biblical view. Here's the biblical model. It's very different than, remember, critical race theory, conflict is inevitable. The whole story of humanity is oppressed and oppressor groups struggling with one another, and the whole system must be turned over so that an oppressed group can get the power that they need, deserve, etc. Bible's got a really different view. We looked at Ephesians, and I'm going to summarize it. Listen to this. We talked about the hostility today between blacks and whites is not nearly the hostility between the Samaritans and the Jews. The Gentiles in general, but oh boy, the Samaritans in particular. They fought wars with each other. They oppressed each other. If you remember, Jews weren't even safe walking through the country of Samaria, and Samaritans were just as poorly received in Judea, where the Jews lived. I know it's hard for us to think anything could be worse than the animosity between black and white. That is historically not true. I mean, it's not good, the animosity between black and white, but this is far greater. And so in the Bible, it talks about what Jesus did is he didn't do a critical theory that said, Jesus said, Samaritans, you've been oppressed, you're going to be in charge. Or Jews, you've been oppressed, you're going to be in charge. He didn't even address that imbalance of power. He didn't say, come on guys, let's sit down at the table and work out a compromise. The biblical model is radically different. It says this, remember, verse 12, when you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship, foreigners to the covenant, without hope and without God, but now you've been brought close through the blood of Christ. It says, he abolished the dividing wall of hostility. And I talked to you last time about the wall where if you were a Gentile and you went past it, the Jews would kill you. The point is they're using that as a metaphor to say, Jesus doesn't accept either one of you. We become new creations in Christ. In other words, it's through Jesus that we find our unity. It's not through a power struggle. It's not through sitting down at the negotiation table. It's by becoming a new creation in Christ. Romans says, for as many of you as were baptized into Christ, were buried with him, and then you were raised to walk in newness of life. You become a new creation. Christianity is not a philosophy. It's not a moral system to make you a better person. It's way more radical. It's there to make you a brand new person. And the Spirit of God will transform you, Romans 8:28. Just read the New Testament. This stuff so fits together. Very coherent message. Will transform you, I'm quoting Romans 8:29, into the image of Jesus Christ. And so he says, neither the Jews nor the Gentiles, nor the white people, nor the black people, nor the any other kind of people, the Serbs, the Croats, the Hutus, the Tutsis, it doesn't make any difference. None of these people are okay. Christianity thinks you don't have a skin problem, you have a sin problem. And sin doesn't have a skin color, and sin does not have an ethnicity. And nobody is okay without Jesus Christ. And the only unity is in Christ. This is a radically different way of looking at the situation. And so, instead of critical race theory that says life is conflict, I mean, suppose you're in an oppressed group and next thing you know, you overthrow everything, turn everything around, and you run this country. How long do you want to run it? 50 years? 100 years? Till whoever you're oppressing overturns you? I mean, think about the image of what this says. It says, conflict is inevitable and it's eternal and it's all a struggle for power. Here is what Ephesians says, consequently, by coming to Christ, you are no longer foreigners and aliens. You're fellow citizens with each other. Not only that, you are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives. You have been adopted, it goes on to say, into the family. That's why Christians call each other brother and sister. Because of this image that, okay, you're not two warring factions that just became nicer people and treat each other nicer. You actually are now literally brothers and sisters. You are new creations in Christ. Well, I can understand somebody says, well, I don't believe that. I'm not a Christian. Totally get that. You don't believe that. You're a Christian. Good luck with your critical race theory world. I mean, come check back. Let me know how that's working out for you, because it's not going to be pleasant. If this is true, and by the way, this is not a self-certifying system. Critical race theory can't be disproved. And what I mean by that is it's a belief system. If you say, well, I'm not a racist, well, that just proves you're more of a racist than you think. Because you know why? Your skin's white, you're a racist. Well, I've not been oppressed before. Well, you know what? That just tells you don't understand the world. You're a woman, you've been oppressed, right? My point is it's self-certifying. It can't be disproved. What facts are you basing it on that we can look at? It's purely belief system. Christianity can be disproved because Christianity is based in a historical event and what that event means. Very different approach, very different sides to it. Okay, that's my summary. So I watched the other lessons, but I wanted you to see this dichotomy. We'll pause for some questions, but what I want to do next is I want to say, okay, then, given that we view the world in a biblical way, let's hold those assumptions. I told you, given that you view the world from critical race theory, what would you expect? Given that you view the world as a Christian, from a biblical worldview, what then will you do? And the Bible speaks very clearly about how you should think and act when it comes to the issue of race relations. So time out on that. What questions do we have?
During the time of Jesus, was Israel made up of mixed races or similar skin tones when we look at the different tribes, Moabites, others? What were their skin tones, or do we know?
That's a great question. In ancient Israel, what were the skin tones? What were the differences? You have tribal differences, and and this is still true today. The answer is they're all Semitic people. You can't tell them apart. I mean, are there some markers, ethnic markers? I mean, because of your DNA and this big pool, biologists like to talk about population groups. They don't really talk about races. They talk about population groups. So yes, there were certain indicators, but bottom line, it's just like if you go to Israel today, you cannot tell a Palestinian Arab from a Jewish person. You cannot tell the difference. Their skin tone is the same. They look very much the same. They're individual people. There's no big distinguishing marker between them. Their skin color is the same. It's always been the same. Their divisions come from ethnicity. It is, I'm a Moabite in ancient times, or I'm a Samaritan. The Samaritans were Jewish. They just interbred with the people around them. And so I'm a Samaritan, I'm a Jew. You guys probably have 90% the same DNA. It's tribal differences. Ethnicity, tribes, belief systems have historically been orders of magnitude more the cause of conflict than skin color. So good question. The issues there were tribal, not skin color, not an issue in that part of the world. Anybody could be enslaved, didn't matter what your skin color was. You didn't enslave your next door neighbor. I mean, seriously, and that's still true today. Outside the United States, in China, we talked about the ethnic Uyghurs. They're Chinese, but they're an ethnic group and they are being very much oppressed. But their skin color is not different. It's, in other words, human sin does not know a skin color. It doesn't know an ethnicity. It is baked into our fallen nature that we are bent towards sin. Good question. So how would I characterize the general Christian approach? And it would be simply this: love your neighbor. This fundamental idea, which I want to expand on a little bit, is, now first of all, that doesn't make any sense in critical race theory. I want you to realize we're light years away from the way critical race theorists think. Now, this is a very biblical way to think. You have particular obligations to your brothers and sisters in Christ, but you have the obligation to all humanity to love your neighbor. And I want to expand on that just a little bit in a couple of ways. Notice there's no group identity here. In the ancient world and in the modern world, the bottom line usually was love your friends, hate your enemies. That's the way the Jews thought. Love your friends, hate your enemies. The New Testament doesn't talk like that. It says love your neighbor. You have a debt to all humanity to be loving. Now I want to talk about what loving is in the Bible because there are all kinds of definitions. But the point is you have an obligation. Our fundamental commitment is to love our neighbor. This is not a sentimental kind of love, which most of the time when you hear the idea of love being talked about in our cultural terms, it's actually sentimentalism. It's a warm, fuzzy feeling in my heart like you see when the polar bears are drinking Coca-Cola, and it's like, they are so cute. Why can't humanity just get along? I think I love my neighbor. Yeah, you have sentiment going. If you eat some really hot Mexican peppers, you probably hate humanity after that. The point is, it's so changeable, and it's sentimentalism. The other idea of love is indulgence. If you love me, you will agree with me. If you love me, you will validate what I think. That's not biblical love. And you can define love any way you want to, but I just want to make sure you know that's not what the Bible's talking about as love. Second point, Christians don't have the luxury of being partisan, and we certainly have been. I mean, each of us as individuals have been partisan. And what I mean by that is you don't just get to work for the good of people like you. You don't get to be partisan. Now, in critical race theory, you should work hard for your identity group and you should fight against the other identity groups. Christians don't have that luxury. There's nothing there that says, oh, you should be nice to the Christians, but you should really not be nice to the Jews, or you should not be nice to the Muslims, or you should not be nice to the Sikhs, or whatever. You don't have that luxury. The Bible doesn't give you a pass. It's love your neighbor. Love looks past group identity to individuals. That's nonsense to critical race theory. It's everything in the gospel. You are not part of a group. You are an individual. And you're expected to treat your neighbor as a neighbor, not as, oh, that person, that's a black person. That's a Hispanic person. That's a white person. No, that's Joe. That's Louise. The biblical idea is very much individual. And I want to show you that through a parable that you probably know. It's very famous. But the point this parable is making is, what does it look like to love your neighbor? And watch how different this is than critical race theory. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, you are a Jew, you follow the law of Moses. What's written in the law? How do you read it? And he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, of the 613 commandments in the law of Moses that governed the religious life of Jews, these are two. But the rabbis of, probably a century before Jesus was born, had decided that you have to follow all the laws of Moses. But if you wanted to summarize it, probably the best summary would be love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. They weren't saying that's all you need to do. I mean, I kind of hate it when I hear Christians saying, well, here's the deal. You should love God, love your neighbor. It's like, even the Jews didn't think that. I mean, they had 613 laws. There's a lot more to the gospel than that. But that's a good summary of your moral obligations. And Jesus says, yep, that's pretty good. Sounds like you understand this fairly well. Go do that. But he wanted to justify himself. And here's what he wanted to justify. It's like, here's the problem, Jesus. I do love my neighbor as long as they're Jewish. But we think it's okay to hate the other people. And so he says, who is my neighbor? Because that was the issue. The Jews knew that they needed to love their neighbor. They weren't going to disavow that commandment, so they're just going to redefine neighbor. Neighbors are Jews. not non-Jews. It was, you could enslave non-Jews. By the way, this worked the other way too. I mean, this isn't a one-way street here. This is a power struggle throughout all of history. So bottom line, he wants to know, who is my neighbor? To whom do I owe this love? And Jesus tells this parable, and you've heard it before, probably. If you haven't, it's brilliant. He says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell into the hands of robbers. And he's a Jew. He's going from Jerusalem, he's a Jew. And a priest happened to be going down the same road. He's a Jew. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side, because the guy's beaten, bloody, looks like he's probably dead. So too a Levite. Levite's also a Jew. When he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now they both have an excuse. They're going to Jerusalem, and they're going to do their service at the temple, and if he's dead and they touch him, they're ritually unclean and they have to reschedule. Okay, you gotta go 14-day quarantine, COVID quarantine, right? And so it's extremely inconvenient, and so they walk by on the other side. Then Jesus said, but a Samaritan, and they're like, ooh, hate those guys. As he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. Now, I want you to stop. I want you to think about this for a minute. So Samaritans hate Jews, Jews hate Samaritans. I mean, this is way beyond anything that you think is rational. Think Middle East on steroids. Way beyond what you think is rational. When that Samaritan saw that man, did he see a Jew? No, he saw a person who needed help, an individual. There's no group identity. Critical race theory can't explain this. It's like, you don't owe this guy anything because he's a Jew. And Jesus says, oh, you owe this guy a lot because he's your neighbor. And so he has compassion on him, and Jesus kind of piles it on a little bit and said, so he went and he bandaged his wounds. Turned out he wasn't dead. Poured oil and wine on him, treated him for his wounds, put him on his own donkey, took him to an inn, took care of him. Next day, he paid some money and said, look after him. I've got to get on with my business, but when I return, I'll pay you anything else. And Jesus says, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The Jewish guy's thinking like a critical race theorist. Jews good, Samaritans bad. Love your neighbor, love your identity group. Jesus says, no, it's a human being, and it doesn't matter what his skin color is. Skin color would have been the same. Doesn't matter what his skin color is. Doesn't matter that historically his people invaded and killed a ton of Jews. Samaritans were nasty people historically. But the point is that none of that matters. You have a human being who needs help. And so you get this fundamental biblical idea. This is the biblical idea of how we relate to one another and what we owe one another as Christians. We owe everyone to love your neighbor. What does love mean when we talk about loving your neighbor? We're talking about, fundamentally, here's a good working definition. Loving your neighbor is not a feeling. Loving your wife, by the way, loving your husband is not just a feeling by any means, because if that's the case, we'd have a big divorce. Oh, we do have a big divorce rate. Never mind. My point is, biblical love is a decision to do what is best for someone else. Not what they want, although it might be. Not necessarily what they think you should do, but based on what is true, what is best. Simple example. None of you would consider it loving to give drugs to a junkie. So it's obviously not always giving somebody what they want. Sometimes it's tough love and saying, no, I know that's what you want, but I will not help you kill yourself. No, I won't. But I will drive you to treatment center. In other words, love is making a decision to do what is best for others. That's how God so loved the world. Did you think you were so lovable that God just said, you little rascals, you're so cute. I'm going to send my son to die for you. No, nothing in the New Testament talks about that. It said God so loved you because he sees the spark of God in you and you matter as an individual. And he said, we decided to die for you. He didn't die for you because you or I earned it or were worth it. He made a decision. Now that's love. Love is making a decision to do what is best for someone else. This is love. Samaritan doesn't like Jews. This guy he could have easily said, well, my grandfather was enslaved by them. And I'm not trying to make a point here about race. I'm simply trying to make the biblical point that it doesn't matter what identity group, you have a human being in need. And he said, then I'm going to help you. And he did. And Jesus said, who's his neighbor? And he says the same thing to us. This is the biblical, I realize I'm not going into a lot of detail here, but that is the biblical paradigm for all human relations. Race relations included. People are not, it's dehumanizing. And I'm going to give you an opinion, but it's going to be really hard to argue with this. The idea that your identity comes from your group is literally, almost by definition, dehumanizing. You don't matter as an individual. The Bible is just the opposite. Despite your identity group, you matter as an individual. Do you see that difference? Well, that's important because that's what you and I are called to do. We have not always done that. We can confess our sin, but we are called to see past the identity groups and see the individuals in that situation. That's the essence of the Christian approach to all humanity, but certainly to race relations. Which leads me to a more practical question. Given that that's the case, and I'm kind of assuming you go, yeah, I understand that, and that's a challenge. That should convict us a little bit. Am I guilty because of the culture around me sees everybody not as a human being? You're a representative of a class in some way. It's very dehumanizing. Am I buying into that? Or am I looking, and when I see people, I want to see individuals. I want to look past labels. I want to look past identity groups. That's convicting to us. But the last thing I want to talk about is what are some of the specifics? What's a model then for action? This is not exhaustive, but I want to give you 3 things that I think if we'll start here, it will make a huge difference. And it's all based on this paradigm of love your neighbor. First thing is reach out. Racial reconciliation and healing. I'm distressed a little bit by the church thinking about racial reconciliation as something that the church should do. The church is nothing more. It is not an institution. It is nothing more than the collection of believers in a given place. Make sense? So when we say the church needs to be about racial reconciliation, I don't find that to be very meaningful. That's coming from the point of view that the church is an institution. And by the way, critical race theorists see the church as an institution and think it also needs to be torn down because it's inherently racist. The church is no more or no less racist, no more or no less uncompassionate, no more or no less of anything than we are. Church is made up of individuals, it's not a group. Racial reconciliation and healing is not confined to Sunday morning. Rosaria Butterfield, whom I will talk about in our next series, wrote a book, and the title tells you 90% of what you need to know. The gospel comes with a house key. And the point is, Christians loving your neighbor is not an institutional thing. Well, my church is doing this, my church is doing that. Those are good things. I'm not knocking it. The big question comes, what am I doing? Church is not my representative. I am a believer in Christ. And my first thing is reach out. Most of us, one of the critical race theorists said this, and I think he's right. He said, almost no white men, I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember the exact quote. Almost no white men have a black man that they can be honest with. In other words, our circle of friends and our circle of intimate friends, meaning people you actually talk to about more than how's the weather, is almost all white. Now you may be saying, well, I'll bet that same's true about a lot of black people or Hispanic people or whatever people. Yeah, might be. But the point is that we need to reach out beyond our comfort zone. I'm going to give you a counterfactual, I'll give you a thought experiment. If that Jewish lawyer had a lot of friends that were Samaritans, he might say, I still don't agree with what all you Samaritans have done, but you, Bob, you're not a bad guy. And you, Sue, you're pretty nice. Why don't you guys come over for dinner? Treating people as individuals is the only way to break down the dehumanization of identity groups, reaching out and expanding our group of acquaintances and friends. And that doesn't happen in the church building. That happens on the soccer fields, in the break room at work. It happens in, when you're going out shopping, when you're doing whatever you're doing. Embrace people as individuals and expand your circle of friends to include some people that don't look and think exactly the way I do. It's good for us. I mean, dare I repeat the Great Commission, go into all the world and take the gospel. That means even go talk to people that look different than you and I. And so the point is that we really need to be intentional about it. This doesn't happen by accident. And I don't care what your race, I don't care what your skin color is. In general, people tend to gravitate to group. It's true in Sunday school class. Certain groups of people, it's not that they don't like the people on the other side of the room, it's just they've never been to the other side of the room. Have you guys ever been in a Sunday school class? Really, everybody sits on the left side or they sit on the right side and they're like, oh, I didn't even know there was another side to this room. We get comfortable, don't we? That's true for all human beings. Well, as Christians, that's not good enough. We need to reach out and engage people that are different. And I really challenge you, one of the discussion questions is, what are some ways that you can do that? It's healthy for us and it's a godly thing to do. It's embarrassing to me that since I become a pastor, almost all my friends are Christians. It's not that I don't like you, but it's like, hey, I need to make a little more effort to get out of different groups. And so for most of us, most of our friends look like us and kind of think like us. And if that's not the case for you, good for you. Because I do think it's important for us to model this idea that everybody's an individual and we don't just stay in our comfort zone. Love builds up is the fundamental idea. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. I think of this verse every time I teach. It's one of two verses I think of. It says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And every one of your relationships should be like that. What does it mean to say love builds up? Make a decision to do good to everybody that you meet, no matter what their skin color, no matter what their ideology, no matter whether or not they have a Trump sticker or they have a Biden sticker on their car, no matter whether they drive a Ford F-150 or a Chevy Silverado, makes no difference. Treat them as an individual. Love builds up because it seeks the good of the other. Second, compassion does not require agreement. Compassion does not require agreement. I would like to talk to you about the idea of sympathy and empathy at another time, but right now I simply want to say that you can be compassionate without agreeing. And I really think hearing other people's stories is really important. Listen to other people's story. And you will get things from the story. Like, I grew up in Appalachia, and we were very oppressed people, very poor. Deck was stacked against us. People used drugs to keep us down. It's a pandemic in that part of the world. We have been very much mistreated. Now, you can listen to that and you can say, well, I don't know that I agree with all the motives you're projecting on people, and I don't know if the facts do that, but I hear in your voice how this has affected you. In other words, you can be compassionate and listen without agreeing. And you can listen without rebutting. You can listen and be compassionate and without saying, I'm really compassionate for you, but I've written down 4 points in rebuttal and I'd like to take 5 minutes to pass that on to you right now. In other words, sometimes as Christians we think, hey, truth matters. It is the thing that matters. But also grace. Also compassion. And you don't have to speak truth into everybody's story every time you hear it. So in other words, compassion doesn't require agreement. Now that's not going to be true in the critical race theory world, is if you do not agree with me, you do not affirm me, therefore you hate me, therefore you're the enemy. You don't have the luxury to think like that because these are your neighbors. Hear their story. Listen to what they have to say. Be compassionate. So compassion goes a long way. Listen and understand where individuals are coming from. It doesn't mean you have to change your mind about the facts. Doesn't mean you change your mind about true. It just means I care enough to listen to you and have some compassion for, wow, I'll bet that was a hard thing that happened to you. Okay? Third thing, work in areas of agreement. There are going to be people that differ with me over this issue. But I do think there is a time to confront our culture on the things that we disagree about. I think at the ballot box, you ought to vote biblical values to the extent that you can. I know you're voting for a candidate. There's no perfect candidate. Vote biblical values. A lot of people spend most of their time arguing with the culture. There is a time to stand up for truth. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I would just challenge you in this, and I would challenge anybody listening to just show me definitive evidence that the way things are going right now under a critical race theory model of inevitable conflict and a power struggle, I would ask you to tell me how the plight of black people as a group, statistically speaking, is better because of that. My contention is critical race theory approach isn't helping anyone. So my suggestion is, let's find areas that we agree and let's work there. Here's an opinion. I'm going to give you an opinion now. I think a productive way forward for Christians is let's focus on equality of opportunity and equality of rights, and let's begin working towards opportunities for people that don't have reasonably equal opportunities. And I would focus in the area of education and jobs. I think if we spent the time we spent between, I think huge things were accomplished in the civil rights movement in the 60s. I think the Civil Rights Act was a huge step forward. Was it enough? Of course not. It was directionally very important for this country to recommit to its values. Since that time, I recommended another book by a man named Shelby Steele, who's, I have no idea if Dr. Steele is a Christian or not, but his point is, since that time, the plight of black people hasn't really improved all that much. I mean, fundamentally, the road that critical race theory has taken us has not actually delivered on the promise of the Civil Rights Act. I'm going to suggest to you, you spend the next 50 years working on equality of opportunity in education and jobs, everybody will be better. So that's an opinion, and I want to be honest and tell you, I'm giving you an opinion. The Bible says love your neighbor. I'm going to suggest a very practical way is work for equality of opportunity in education and jobs. And that will bring us up to a much more equal level. Critical race theory wants segregation. You're part of this group and never shall the two integrate. That's why critical race theory is departed from Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was for integrating. Let's all be brothers and sisters in Christ. I long for the day when you're not judged by the color of your skin, but the content of your character. That's integration. Critical race theory is never going to happen. White people are going to be racist. You're always going to be black. I'm not being facetious. That's the way it is. And so you have an inherent division. I really think that ideology is bankrupt, but I do think to the extent that we can all get focused on education and jobs, you give that 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, things will be very different here. I'm just going to suggest as Christians, we go advocate for more equality, more opportunity for every child in this nation, no matter what. And there are inequalities in this country. Well, let's go work on that. I think that's where it makes a difference. So I'm not opposed to rebutting ideas that we think are very, very bad for humanity. But I really think the productive work, because I don't think a lot of productive things are happening right now. Nobody's life's getting better. Defund the police? Are you kidding me? I mean, think about this for a minute. Destroy that structure because it's systemically racist? Does it need change? Fair, but destroy it? No one thinks that's a good idea. Black people, Hispanic people, white people, men, women, no one thinks that's a good idea. So it's a terrible approach. But instead of just crying and yelling at that, saying terrible approach, let's go work on the things that are a good approach. And that's why I say work in the areas of agreement. Work on things that actually make people's lives better. That's an opinion. Thank you for indulging me. Questions?
You said earlier that Christianity could be disproved. What did you mean by that? Do you believe that it is not true?
When I said Christianity could be disproved, what I mean is it's not self-certifying. You can't disprove critical race theory. Because if you say, well, look at that black man, he doesn't agree with you, so your identity thing doesn't work. He's not really black. Well, historically, you look at that. got an excuse for that. Well, I'm a white person and I'm not racist. You just think you're not racist. I'm a white person. My ancestors didn't oppress anybody. They weren't even in this country in the 1800s. Doesn't matter. Skin's white, you're racist. In fact, the fact that you don't think you're racist proves you're actually racist. And you see what I'm trying to say? I'm not trying to be facetious. It's self-certifying. It can't be disproved. It is a pure belief system. Christianity can be disproved. It is not unproven. I do believe it's true. I'm simply saying if you show up tomorrow with DNA evidence that those are Jesus' bones, Christianity is not true. If you can demonstrate that Jesus was not raised from the dead, and the preponderance of the evidence indicates so, you have a powerful argument that Christianity is not true. All I meant to say is it is disprovable because it makes contentions that can be tested. Critical race theory makes contentions that cannot be argued against, cannot be tested. It's a kind of a technical point, but it's actually quite important, is that Christianity makes claims that, well, you try to disprove it if you want to disprove it. So I do believe it is true. I just believe it is not self-certifying. It's not just a big leap of faith. Critical race theory is very much a big leap of faith. This historical evidence is not sufficient to demonstrate that that is true. There'll be people that disagree. I would say, let's look at the evidence. But your desire to look at the evidence is just your truth, not my truth. You see what I'm talking about, self-certifying? There's no way to disprove it. Christianity, you dig up Jesus' bones, you show that the resurrection didn't happen, you have a really good argument that Christianity is not right. The Apostle Paul said, if Christ is not raised, our faith is in vain. What's he saying? He's saying, this is reasonable. Does it have faith? Yes, but is it based in history? Does it have a reasonable basis? Yes, it does. So, good question.
How do we as Christians handle critical race theory when it is intertwined in the church?
Yes, so how do we as Christians handle critical race theory when it's intertwined in the church? It should be apparent to you at this point that critical race theory is not compatible with a biblical view of humanity. There are going to be people that are very much unhappy with me for saying that. I'm just going to say it based on the biblical model and critical race theories. Actually, you're going to have to show me, don't just emote to me, but you're going to have to demonstrate to me how those two can be reconciled. Because I don't think a rational person would say those two can be reconciled. Nevertheless, let me be fair, there are people who are Christians who adopt this model of viewing the world. And they say this is also a Christ-endorsed model of viewing the world. That's not new, but it's not true. I mean, my point is that statement is not self-evidently true. You need to support that. You can't just cherry pick the Bible. You need to show how the Bible lines up with that. Now, can you just say Jesus loved everybody? Ergo, critical race theory. Yeah, you really can't do that. I mean, you can't really do that with anything. You can prove anything if you want to cherry pick it. The point is, let's have a serious discussion about what the Bible says. You're going to find that's fairly lacking in my view. But that is what one would need to do to reconcile those two. Are there Christians who say, yeah, well, I do reconcile those two, and I do think Jesus is for critical race theory? Let's work in the areas in which we agree. Fair enough? We will disagree about that. Does that mean we need to hate each other? I don't have that luxury. I'm called to love my neighbor. I'm not called to tell my neighbor that she's right. I'm not called to say, oh yeah, I'll validate you and you've got everything right. No, I'm not called to that, but I am called to do what's best. And you know what's best sometimes is, well, can we at least agree that, go back to that we could work on jobs and education? Yeah, let's just do that together for now. In other words, let's try to find, that's why I said let's work in areas of agreement if we can find them, because it actually makes a difference. Fighting isn't helping anybody. But working together is, and it doesn't mean that we have to agree. So that's my prescription for that, personally. Again, some of this you're getting now is personal opinion. What I've showed you before is very much from the sources and the biblical, but this is you, I want to challenge you. How then, given those principles, do I walk this out? And I would suggest reach out. Let's get out of our cultural echo chambers a little bit. Secondly, let's just have compassion and listen to each other's story. I don't think that's going to mean we're going to end up agreeing. I just think it's going to build a human bond. between us, a little bond of humanity. Let's get past the ideology and get a little humanity. We may disagree, but it doesn't mean we can't be friends. I mean, civilized people can be friends when they disagree. And then finally, let's look for areas where we can work in agreement so we actually do something for the people that need the help. Typically, when you get into things like critical race theory and you get these battles of ideology, the people that actually need the help are just collateral damage. And I'd say, let's go work and let's choose to love our fellow man by doing what makes your life better. So that would be my suggestion. I hope you're more creative, you come up with even better ideas, but that's our commitment, is to live that out.
Critical race theory has become prevalent in many of our schools. How should we deal with that?
Critical race theory has become prevalent in many of our schools. Brilliant move. It's called indoctrination. I'm going to say something that you might also find objectionable, but the data bears this out, is that American schools, American government education, what we call public education, but it's controlled by our government, used to be controlled largely on a local level. And I think that's very healthy, but less and less so at this point. The government is issuing, the federal government in America is issuing a lot of edicts like critical race theory and overriding local because they have the purse strings. So to that extent, what you have happening is the government schools are being used as instruments of indoctrination more than instruments of education. As Americans, vote, 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 vote. That is the tool that our culture and our government gives us to speak our voices. We need to vote because here's my point. We could argue ideologically about whether or not that's a good thing to teach in schools. I think it's a horrendous idea. I mean, in the sense that, and I don't care if you said, well, let's go teach every kid in there Christianity. I don't think that's necessarily a good idea in America. I think it's great for us to teach our children Christianity, but I'm not sure that the government ought to be mandating it, right? So why is the government mandating this belief system? Well, we can argue about that all day long, but guess who gets hurt out of that? American kids aren't getting educated. And I'm not bashing our teachers. I think most teachers really care about kids and really want to educate kids. But I don't think, well, this is not a matter of opinion. Statistics would indicate to you that American children are not being successfully educated. And so I would work as hard as we could for the interests of the children. Now, everybody says they have the interest of the children. That's not true. But I'd actually say, here's again, let's love our neighbor. What actually helps these kids? And if that means get this brainwashing out because they're not getting educated, I'd vote, I'd do whatever was legal, a good citizen might be able to do. I'd advocate, I'd do whatever I could to get that out and to get education in. Because let me just pinpoint this. This has nothing to do with skin color. But let me put it this way. You're a black child and you already face some hurdles in this country because you're a minority. Let's assume for a minute that that is true, that you face hurdles. Not getting an education dooms you. It dooms you. The statistics are so clear on this. So as a Christian, my attitude is, I really don't care about debating all this ideology. I really don't care about all the posturing. I'm going to vote and I'm going to advocate for people that are actually going to effectively educate these kids so they have a chance. How does that look? Take action. Do what it looks like. In other words, somebody actually needs to love their neighbor when their neighbor is a little kid, the deck is being stacked against them before they ever even get out of elementary school. I think, and I hope, we could agree on that across ideological lines. Now, I realize that's Pollyanna. Power matters to people. And to some people, children are a pawn. But for us, this is serious, and we need to choose and advocate for things that will actually make a difference for those kids. That just seems, let's cut through the ideology and say, that's what I want to work on. And I think that the children in particular here, the next generation, are the ones who are paying the price for these ideological power struggles. And I don't think God's going to be very happy about that. So let's be agents to do what we can about it. Good question. You guys are getting good ideas already, and how can we go forward? But forget, love your neighbor. We're about individuals. We're about human-to-human contact. Reach out to people that look different, have a different background, hear their stories, have compassion, and work where we can find agreement rather than always focusing on our differences. I think that will be a few steps that would go a long way towards bringing unity and healing. And I think when people see us behave in that way, I think the culture is going to persecute us. But those individuals who say, you know, I don't like it here in critical race theory land. This is a very harsh world. Well, guess what? The world of Jesus was even harsher, and the gospel exploded. Why does the gospel explode? I can have a struggle all my life against the oppressor or the oppressed or whatever, or I can be adopted into God's family and be brothers and sisters. I don't know which sounds better to you. The point is the gospel has huge power. Trust the gospel, tell the story. I really appreciate you guys listening to this. I realize we've left out more than we've talked about, but I hope it's been helpful. I hope we've achieved our 3 goals. Understand critical race theory, which is the predominant idea. Second, understand the biblical model and how very different it is. And thirdly, what does it mean to love our neighbor, and how do we practically walk that out? Well, I thought we might take a break in our next series, which will start next week. I thought we'd stay with what the Bible speaks because I really want to get into the Bible more and help us understand our marching orders, but I thought we'd take on something just a little bit easier and not so emotionally charged. So we're going to talk about what does the Bible have to say about gender and sexuality. I'll see you next week.